Sarah was a flight attendant who had seen it all, or at least she thought she had, as she moved quickly down the aisle greeting passengers. On the morning flight from a small rural town to the city, there was something about today that felt different, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Maybe it was the weather, the plane's slight dip in altitude, or the way the sun glinted off the wing, casting a strange shadow over the cabin. But she was distracted by a man boarding who stood out in a way she wasn't used to seeing in the uniformed businessmen and vacationers crowding the plane. This man was older, wearing faded jeans, a weathered cowboy hat, and boots that seemed far too heavy for a flight like this. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, his steps heavy, but steady, like someone who had spent years working the land, and Sarah found herself staring for a moment before she snapped back to attention as she approached him to help him with his bag. She could feel a small chuckle bubble up inside her when he greeted her with a slow southern drawl, his accent thick, like syrup dripping off the words he spoke. And it was the kind of accent that Sarah wasn't used to hearing on a flight like this. In fact, she'd never met someone who sounded quite like him before, and for a split second she couldn't help herself. She let out a quiet laugh under her breath, shaking her head at the sound of his words. It was just so out of place, so different from the polished city folk she was accustomed to serving. And as she guided him to his seat, her amusement lingered just a little longer than she meant it to. "Right here, sir," she said with a forced smile as she watched him settle into his seat and begin pulling out a thick leather wallet from his back pocket. His hands were warm, as though they had seen years of hard labor, the wrinkles in his palms telling stories Sarah could only guess at. And as she walked away to check on other passengers, she couldn't shake the image of the man or the strange feeling that something wasn't quite right in the way she dismissed him so casually. As the plane ascended into the sky, Sarah continued with her routine, serving drinks and snacks with practiced ease, but every now and then her eyes would drift back to the farmer, who sat quietly by the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Outside not a word passed his lips for minutes, and yet there was something undeniably commanding about the way he carried himself. She overheard him talking to the woman beside him, who had struck up a conversation asking about his farm and his life back home in the country, his voice steady and filled with an old wisdom. She couldn't help but eavesdrop just a little. "I've been farming this land for more than 30 years, he said with a faint smile. "It's been a struggle some days, but you learn to make it work when you're up against the dirt and the weather." His voice was rich with experience, the kind that spoke of years of hardship and perseverance, and it caught Sarah off guard for the first time. She felt a flicker of respect for the man, but she quickly pushed it aside, laughing at herself for even thinking about it. After all, he was just a farmer, wasn't he? Then, as the conversation continued, Sarah couldn't help but overhear something that stopped her in her tracks. The man was telling the woman about a major deal. He was heading to the city for a meeting about the sale of his family's farm to a big corporation. The company wanted his land for a new development project. Sarah was stunned. The man was a farmer, yes, but he wasn't just any farmer. He was negotiating the sale of a huge piece of land, a deal worth millions of dollars. And suddenly everything she had thought about him, steamed off the farmer in the cowboy hat, wasn't the simple, uneducated man she had made him out to be in her head. He was something much more. As Sarah moved down the aisle again, her mind kept drifting back to the farmer. The more she thought about him, the more she felt uneasy. Her initial laughter at his accent now seemed so misplaced, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had misjudged him in some way. Maybe it was his calmness, the way he held himself, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing, or maybe it was the quiet confidence in his voice when he spoke about the land and the deal he was negotiating. But either way, Sarah felt a flicker of guilt building inside her. It was a strange feeling, something she wasn't used to, especially not in her line of work. She had learned to keep her emotions in check and keep things light and pleasant for the passengers. But something about this farmer was different. Just as she passed by his seat again, she noticed the man had pulled out a small notebook and was scribbling down numbers furiously on a piece of paper. The numbers didn't make sense to her, but there was something about the way he worked that made Sarah pause for a moment. She watched as he added something, and then crossed it out with a frown on his face, his brow furrowed, as if he was deep in thought. Sarah wasn't sure what to think. Maybe it was the stress of his big deal waiting on him, or maybe there was something more to him than she could understand. But before she could dwell on it too long, the captain's voice interrupted the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain calm. We will be making an emergency landing at the nearest airport." The calm but firm voice sent a ripple of anxiety through the cabin. Sarah felt her stomach drop, and in the blink of an eye the easygoing flight had turned into something far more intense. She glanced back at the farmer, who was still sitting there with his hands on his lap, looking out the window, as though nothing had changed, his expression unreadable. The plane began to shake slightly, a jolt that was barely noticeable at first. But then it came again, harder this time. The overhead bins rattled, the lights flickered, and a quiet murmur spread through the cabin. Sarah felt a knot in her stomach. She had seen this before, but never from this perspective. Her heart was racing as passengers started to look around nervously. Whispers started to build into murmurs of fear, and she could feel the panic rising in the air. She moved quickly down the aisle, trying to calm the passengers, reassure them that everything was going to be fine. But her hands were shaking, her voice was shaky, and she knew it wasn't helping. The sense of unease was thick in the air. But then she saw him again. The farmer was still sitting there in his seat, completely calm, not moving a muscle, his face set in a determined expression. He wasn't panicking, he wasn't even worried. He was just watching the events unfold, as if he had seen this kind of thing before. Sarah stopped for a moment, her instincts telling her to keep moving, but her curiosity got the better of her. She leaned over and whispered, "Sir, are you okay?" Her voice was barely audible over the rising noise of the cabin. He looked at her for a second, his eyes calm and steady, before he nodded slowly. "I'm fine, miss. Just remember to breathe and keep the others calm," he said, his voice as steady as ever, the words simple but reassuring. It wasn't until then that Sarah realized how much the passengers had been looking to him for reassurance. They had stopped glancing at the flight attendants and were now watching the farmer for guidance. His presence seemed to steady them, even as the plane began to shudder once more. She was stunned. She had underestimated him before, but now she couldn't help but admire how he handled the situation. He wasn't just calm, he was taking control without even trying. Sarah felt the embarrassment creeping in as she realized how wrong she had been about him. This wasn't just some simple farmer. He was someone who had faced adversity before, someone who knew how to deal with a crisis. As the plane shook once more, a sudden wave of turbulence sent Sarah's heart racing. She grabbed onto the nearest seat to steady herself. As the cabin hummed with fear, the lights flickered again, and passengers gasped nervously, some clutching their armrests, others muttering prayers under their breath. Sarah moved quickly up and down the aisle, trying to reassure them, her voice trembling as she spoke. But it wasn't enough. The fear was palpable, and she could feel it seeping into her own chest. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep her composure. She had always prided herself on staying calm in tough situations, but today was different. This was more than just a few bumps in the air. This was real. This was an emergency. But through the chaos she saw him again, the farmer sitting calmly with his hands folded neatly in his lap, his eyes fixed on the seat in front of him. There was something almost eerie about how unaffected he seemed, like the turbulence was nothing more than a mild inconvenience to him. Sarah found herself staring at him again. She couldn't help it. His calm demeanor was like a stark contrast to the panic that was slowly swallowing the cabin. Passengers were looking at him now, some even turning toward him, as if waiting for some sign of what to do next. He caught her eye and smiled slightly, not in a smug way, but in a way that almost felt reassuring, like he knew something they didn't. His presence had a strange effect on the cabin. It was as if everyone had started to breathe a little easier just by having him there. Sarah couldn't understand it at first. How could this man with his rough clothes and thick accent command such authority without a word? But the more she watched, the more she realized it wasn't about his clothes or his accent. It was about the way he carried himself, the way he moved through life with a quiet confidence that people could feel even in the most chaotic moments. She felt a pang of guilt again. How many times had she dismissed people like him just because they didn't fit her idea of who should be in control or in charge? As the plane continued to dip and jolt, Sarah noticed something else. The farmer had started talking again, this time to the elderly couple sitting next to him, his voice low and steady. "Just stay calm, folks. Take deep breaths. We're gonna be just fine," he said. And somehow those simple words made the woman next to him stop clutching her armrest and relax just a little. Sarah watched as the couple nodded in response, their fear fading away. The other passengers were looking toward him now, and Sarah found herself frozen in place, watching as this man, who was once nothing more than a source of her amusement, became the center of attention in the middle of a crisis. The intercom crackled again, but this time the captain's voice was different. It was more urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts. We are preparing for emergency landing. The plane is experiencing a serious issue, and we will be touching down in a few minutes. Please remain calm and stay in your seats." The announcement only heightened the tension. But as the flight attendants moved to secure the cabin, the farmer stood up slowly. Sarah's stomach turned as she watched him rise to his feet. The last thing she expected was for him to take charge, but that's exactly what he did. He walked down the aisle with purpose, his steps firm and steady, his presence commanding attention without being forceful. "Everyone just stay in your seats and listen to the crew," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the passengers. "We'll get through this." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen anything like it before. He wasn't just reassuring them, he was leading them through the chaos. And in that moment, Sarah realized just how much she had underestimated him. She had dismissed him as just a farmer, but he was so much more than that. He was a man of strength and experience, someone who knew how to face danger head-on with nothing but his calm and his words. The plane tilted sharply to one side, and the roar of the engines intensified, as if struggling to stay aloft. A few passengers let out nervous gasps, while others tightened their grip on the armrests. Sarah could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. The fear was suffocating now. Everyone was awake to the reality of the situation. The plane wasn't just having a rough flight, it was in serious trouble. The cabin began to buzz with hushed voices and anxious whispers. The atmosphere was thick with tension. But through all of it, Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from the farmer. His steady presence seemed to anchor her even in the chaos, and she found herself silently following his movements as he continued to speak to the passengers, his voice calm and firm. "We're gonna be fine, folks. Just trust the crew and stay calm." He repeated, his voice low, but somehow it carried across the entire cabin. Every word he spoke seemed to cut through the rising panic, as if he were a beacon of stability in a sea of uncertainty. Passengers were listening to him now, looking to him for reassurance. Sarah noticed how they were no longer waiting for the flight attendants to take control. They were waiting for the farmer to give them direction. And in that moment, Sarah realized something profound. She had always thought that authority came from uniforms or titles or experience in high-pressure jobs. But here was a man whose experience came from a different place. His authority came from the simple way he faced the world with quiet courage and no fear. Just as she was about to move toward the cockpit to check on the situation again, a sudden jolt rocked the plane harder than before. It felt as if the whole thing had dropped several feet. At once a few passengers screamed in terror, and others clung to their seat belts. White-knuckled, Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. The plane was spiraling. She could hear the shrill sound of people praying or sobbing quietly, and panic spread through the cabin like wildfire. But there was the farmer again, standing at the front of his seat, his face resolute, his eyes scanning the passengers with a piercing gaze, as if searching for anyone who needed help. "Keep calm, just breathe, folks," he said, his voice a steady anchor in the storm. Sarah's breath was coming quicker now. She had never felt so helpless. She had always been the one people looked to in times of trouble. But this time it was different. She was no longer in control this time. She was the one needing reassurance. And strangely enough, it was the farmer who was providing it. She looked around at the other passengers, their eyes fixed on him. The fear was still there, but it was tempered now by the farmer's steady command. He had taken charge of the moment, without ever asking for it or demanding it. The plane dipped again, and Sarah's stomach lurched, but this time she didn't panic. Instead, she found herself taking deep breaths, just like the farmer had suggested. It was odd how his calmness was starting to settle her own nerves, how his presence seemed to give her the strength to keep it together. But it wasn't just that, it was the realization that maybe she had been wrong about so many things her whole life. Maybe she had been too quick to judge people based on appearances and assumptions. Maybe the real strength wasn't in fancy degrees or polished speeches. Maybe it was in the quiet resilience of people like him. "We're almost there," the farmer said again. And this time his words didn't feel like a mere reassurance. They felt like a promise that no matter how bad things got, he would remain calm and steady through it all. And in that moment, Sarah understood something she had never really thought about before. It wasn't the uniforms, or the titles, or the flashy degrees that defined leadership. It was the ability to remain grounded when everything else was falling apart. The plane descended rapidly, and the ground below was becoming clear with each passing second. Sarah could feel the pressure in her chest. The air had thickened with fear. Passengers were holding their breath. The moment they had all been dreading was finally upon them. The emergency landing was imminent. But through it all, Sarah kept her eyes on the farmer. His steady presence was like a lighthouse in a storm. He stood at the front of his seat, his eyes fixed on the horizon outside, his face calm and focused as if he had done this 100 times before. His hands were steady, not trembling, not even the slightest hint of fear in his posture. As the plane dropped again, his voice echoed across the cabin. "Stay calm, folks, we're going to be all right." The simple words sent a ripple of reassurance through the passengers. Sarah could see it in their faces. The panic that had once gripped them was slowly being replaced with something else, a quiet hope. For a moment, Sarah felt almost embarrassed again. She had laughed at him earlier. She had dismissed him as just another farmer. And now here he was standing tall and strong. While she felt herself faltering in the face of fear, she had spent years training to handle these situations. But nothing in her training had prepared her for this. She had never been taught how to manage her own fear. When everything seemed to be slipping away, she had never been taught how to find strength when her own confidence was gone. But the farmer had found it, without thinking, without hesitation. And now it was clear to her that he wasn't just a man from the countryside. He was someone who had learned how to face the unknown with grace and determination. The plane lurched again, and the screeching sound of metal scraping against metal sent a wave of panic through the cabin. The lights flickered one more time, and then went out completely, plunging the plane into darkness. A few passengers gasped in terror, and Sarah heard a child crying out in fear. But once again the farmer was there, his voice cutting through the chaos like a beacon. "Keep your seatbelts on and stay calm." He said his words simple, but they carried weight. They grounded the room somehow, just by being spoken with the quiet authority only someone who had lived through hardship could have. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Her mind was racing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the farmer's calmness wasn't just for show. It was real, it was genuine, and it was contagious. She felt it in her own chest as she focused on his voice. Instead of her own rising panic, slowly she began to feel a sense of clarity, a strange stillness. taking over the fear that had gripped her moments ago, began to subside as she focused on doing her job, making sure the passengers were secure, reassuring those who needed it. But every time she turned her attention back to the farmer, she found herself marveling at how he was handling the situation. His calm had become a lifeline for her. The landing gear thudded as it deployed, and the plane's descent grew steeper. The sound of the wind rushing outside was deafening, but still the farmer stood there, unmoving, his gaze unwavering. He was no longer just a passenger. He was the one who seemed to be leading them all through this. He was the one who seemed to have control in a situation where nobody else did. Sarah couldn't help but feel a deep sense of respect building within her for him, this man who had remained so grounded in the face of the unknown. The plane's nose dipped, and the runway came into view, the lights on the tarmac flashing bright beneath the darkness. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as the wheels touched down with a loud screech. The jolt threw everyone forward. But the farmer didn't move, not even a flinch. He was still standing, as if he had known this moment was coming, and was ready for it. And as the plane skidded to a stop, a hush fell over the cabin. For the first time in what felt like hours, everything was silent, and Sarah could hear the pounding of her own heart as she stood frozen in place. The plane screeched to a halt, and the emergency lights flickered on, bathing the cabin in an eerie red glow. The sudden silence was almost deafening. After the chaos of the descent, Sarah could hear the heavy breathing of the passengers and the soft sound of her own heartbeat thudding in her chest. She stood frozen for a moment, her mind still racing, unsure of what to do next. But then the calmness of the farmer's presence cut through the fog in her mind. She turned to see him still standing at the front of his seat, his face as composed as it had been throughout the entire ordeal. He was no longer just a farmer to her. He was a symbol of strength, a reminder that calm in the storm was the most powerful tool anyone could have. "All right, folks," the farmer's voice was steady again as he spoke to the passengers. "We made it now. Stay in your seats till the crew gives you the all clear." His words were simple, but they carried the same quiet authority as before, and as the passengers began to stir, Sarah couldn't help but notice how many of them were looking at him instead of the flight attendants for guidance. It wasn't just a few people anymore. It was nearly everyone in the cabin. All eyes were on him. They trusted him more than they trusted the crew. In that moment, Sarah couldn't help but feel a deep sense of humility. She had spent so many years learning the skills of a flight attendant, but here was a man who had never trained for a job like this. And yet he had done what she had failed to do in the most crucial of moments. He had kept the passengers calm. He had given them something to hold on to when everything around them was falling apart. As the plane's engines wound down and the flight attendants began to move through the cabin, making sure everyone was okay, Sarah found herself walking toward the farmer. She had no words at first, unsure of what to say to this man who had shown her what real leadership looked like. But when she reached him, he looked up and smiled, not in a smug way, but with genuine kindness and something deeper, something that told Sarah he knew exactly what she was thinking. "You did good, miss," he said quietly, his voice still low, but it carried the weight of his approval. Sarah blinked at him, stunned by the compliment, but at the same time she felt a wave of gratitude rush over her. She had expected to feel pride or relief, but instead she felt something more humbling, a quiet sense of respect for the man who had taught her more about leadership in a few hours than she had learned in years. "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, but it felt like the right thing to say. The words were simple, but they carried the sincerity she had been holding back all this time. She had always been the one people turned to, but now she realized that sometimes true strength wasn't about having all the answers or being the one who could fix everything. It was about knowing when to stay quiet and steady when everyone else was losing their grip, and trusting in the calm that could guide them through the storm. He gave her a small nod before looking back toward the window, his hands resting comfortably on his lap. Sarah glanced at him one more time before turning to check on the other passengers. she knew the crisis was over, but something had shifted inside her, something that would stay with her long after the plane had landed safely on the ground. She had learned a valuable lesson that day about leadership and about humility, about how strength could come from the most unexpected places, and how sometimes the quietest people had the most to teach. As the emergency vehicles rolled up to the plane and the passengers were slowly ushered off the plane, Sarah stayed behind for a moment, taking a deep breath and letting the weight of everything settle over her. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the respect she now felt for the man who had taught her that leadership wasn't about who had the loudest voice or the most authority. It was about the calm that comes from within and the ability to guide others through the toughest of moments without flinching. As the last of the passengers made their way off the plane, Sarah lingered in her seat. She watched the emergency crews move around the aircraft with practiced precision. The flashing lights outside bathed the scene in red and blue as paramedics tended to a few shaken passengers. But most of the crowd had calmed down. The worst was over. Sarah felt the familiar weight of exhaustion pressing down on her, but it wasn't the same as before. Something had shifted within her. She had been through plenty of emergency situations, but none had left her feeling this way before. None had forced her to look so deeply at herself. None had humbled her so thoroughly. She turned and glanced back at the farmer, who was now standing near the door waiting to leave the plane like everyone else. But he wasn't rushing, he wasn't hurried. He was standing tall with his shoulders back, his expression as calm as it had been the entire flight. And Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that he was the reason this had all gone as smoothly as it had. He had been the steady anchor in the storm, while she had been swept up in the chaos. The flight attendants were finishing their checks when Sarah made her way over to him. She didn't even know what she was going to say. She had so many questions. But somehow she knew he wouldn't give her the answers she was expecting. The farmer turned to her as she approached, and his face softened when he saw her. "You all right, miss?" he asked, his voice still gentle, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a way that made him seem older than she had originally thought. He hadn't said much during the entire ordeal, but somehow his presence had spoken louder than any words could ever have. "I am now," Sarah replied quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of gratitude and awe. She hadn't realized until now how much she had needed to hear those words. She had been trying to hold everything together so tightly, but in that moment she allowed herself to let go just a little. "You did good," the farmer said, his voice low, but filled with sincerity. "In times like these, it's easy to let fear take over. But you kept your head together." His words didn't feel like praise. They felt like something deeper, something that acknowledged the quiet strength she hadn't known she had within herself. It was the kind of recognition she hadn't expected to get from someone like him, but it meant more than she could have imagined. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight. She had spent so much of her life seeking approval from others, looking for validation from passengers or her colleagues. But this felt different. This felt real. It wasn't about the uniform or the badge. It wasn't about being in charge or having all the answers. It was about finding the courage to face the unknown, and the farmer had shown her that in the most unexpected way. "Thank you," she said again, her voice shaky, but full of meaning. She wanted to say more, but the words felt inadequate. She couldn't explain to him how much this moment had shifted her, how much she had taught her in such a short time. But somehow she knew he understood. There was no need for elaborate speeches or explanations. The lesson had been learned. He nodded once more and gave her a small smile. "You're welcome, miss," he said before turning toward the door and stepping off the plane. Sarah watched him leave, and for the first time in a long time she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The plane had landed safely. The passengers were all right. But it was the lesson she had learned from the farmer that would stay with her long after the flight had ended. She had learned that strength wasn't about being loud or commanding. It was about being steady when everything else seemed to be falling apart. It was about being present in the moment and knowing that you could handle whatever came your way, even when you didn't have all the answers. As the last of the passengers disembarked, Sarah finally took a deep breath and let it out slowly. She had survived the flight, she had faced her own fears, and she had found a new understanding of what it meant to lead with calmness and humility. She could still hear the farmer's voice in her mind, echoing through the chaos, "Stay calm, just breathe." And for the first time, Sarah truly understood what those words meant. As the last of the passengers were escorted off the plane and the emergency teams finished their work, Sarah stood at the front of the cabin. Her legs were shaky, and her mind was still buzzing with the events of the flight. But there was something else now, something that had been growing inside her ever since the moment the farmer had stepped forward to take control. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. But she knew it was more than just gratitude. It was a shift, a deep change in the way she viewed the world and herself. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being the one others could turn to in moments of chaos. But today she had seen what true strength really looked like. It wasn't in the loudest voice or the most authoritative presence. It was in the quiet assurance that everything would be okay, even when the world was falling apart. It was in the calm that settled over the passengers. When the farmer spoke, it was in the way his steady gaze had grounded her when she had been on the brink of panic. Sarah took a slow breath as she looked out the small window of the plane. The emergency lights had faded now, and the night outside was peaceful. The contrast felt surreal. She had just been part of something terrifying, yet now everything seemed so calm, so ordinary. She wondered how long it would take for the memory of the flight to fade, for the passengers to go back to their daily lives and forget the fear they had faced. She wondered if the farmer would ever realize the impact he had made on them all, or if he would simply walk away without ever knowing that his actions had changed them in ways they couldn't explain. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave the plane, Sarah spotted the farmer in the distance. He was standing by a car waiting to be picked up. He looked just like any other person now, just a man in simple clothes with a weathered face and hands that told the story of a life lived on the land. But to Sarah, he wasn't just any man. He was the person who had saved them all, not with grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but with a steady hand and a quiet confidence that had spread through the cabin like wildfire. She walked toward him slowly, her heart still pounding from the adrenaline, but with a new sense of clarity. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say, but she knew she had to say something. When she reached him, she hesitated for a moment, unsure of the right words. But then she simply said, "I don't think I ever properly thanked you." Her voice was calm, but her eyes held the weight of everything she had learned in the past few hours. "You saved us today." The farmer looked at her for a moment, his eyes softening just slightly as if he understood exactly what she meant. "We all just did our part," he replied, his voice humble, but Sarah could hear the warmth in it. "I didn't do anything special." But to her it wasn't just about what he did, it was about how he did it. It was about how he had been the rock for everyone else to hold on to when everything seemed to be falling apart, how he had remained unshaken when even the most seasoned flight attendants were struggling to keep it together. "You did more than that," Sarah said softly, her voice steady now. "You taught me what it really means to be a leader." The farmer gave her a small nod, and for a moment they stood in silence together, a quiet understanding passing between them. There was no need for words between them now, no need to explain the impact of the day, because they both understood the weight of it in their own way. With a final smile, the farmer tipped his hat and turned to leave. He didn't say anything else, but Sarah didn't need him to. The lesson had been learned. She had learned to embrace the calm in the chaos, to lead by example, not by words, to stay grounded, even when everything seemed to be spiraling out of control. She watched as he walked away into the night, and for the first time she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. She knew she would never forget this flight, the lessons it had taught her, or the man who had shown her what true strength looked like. She had started the day as a flight attendant who thought she knew it all, but she was leaving as someone who had discovered the quiet power of resilience and humility.